Hello, and welcome to Season 8 of the Canadian Women's Foundation podcast, All Right, Now What? Gender equality and justice, where we live, work, learn, and play is the goal, and it makes life better for everyone. All Right, Now What? Remains a space where we ask, how do we move from awareness to action? But this season, we're also shifting the story. Through powerful storytelling, expert interviews, and bold conversations, we'll explore what true equity can look like, especially for those who are too often silenced or overlooked. The work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and its partners takes place on traditional First Nations, Inuit, and Métis territories. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, we recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations.
Hi, I'm Kahanee and Ravayat from the Canadian Women's Foundation. Today, we're joined by writer, keynote speaker, and peacebuilder Somia Sadiq. In our conversation, Somia shares how her upbringing shaped by learning from her elders guided her towards a practice rooted in listening, storytelling, and holding space for complexity. We talk about what it means to move beyond binaries of right and wrong, and how creating space for multiple truths can open the door to deeper understanding and meaningful conflict transformation. Somia also reflects on the role of storytelling in her work, from oral traditions to trauma-informed approaches, and how stories can become powerful tools for healing, connection, and reclaiming identity. Together, we explore how change doesn't always have to be loud to be powerful, why peace building begins within ourselves, and what it looks like to create spaces for voices that are too often underheard. Well, hi, Somia. Thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to have you on the podcast today to talk about your work and your new book. And so, yeah, welcome. One of the things, as soon as I learned you were going to be on the podcast, of course, I do my research and I was looking you up, immediately ordered your book. But one thing that stood out to me is in, the many words you use to describe yourself, peace builder was a word you use, and I haven't seen that used before. And I am curious if you can tell me what that means to you, what your journey has been like to become and identify yourself as a peace builder.
So I'll go back to, I suppose in some ways, the beginning of the story. One of my favorite quotes, I love Rumi, and one of my favorite quotes of Rumi is, "Out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrongdoing is a field. I'll meet you there." And I refer to that actually in the book as well. And ultimately, the intention behind that field is that there are no wrong ideas and right ideas. And that can be a very tricky place for any of us to be in, because we all grow up with so many notions of what's right and wrong. Often that's what any religious ideology is really deeply anchored in. That's what cultural beliefs are anchored in. That's how we're parented. So there's, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, what you can do, what you can't do. So there's a lot of those binaries that we grow up in. So it only feels natural then that when conflict arises, that we take these very hard positions of what is right and what is wrong. And over the years, I've often found myself surprised when I hear an opinion that's way out there and very different from my own. And just when I think I've heard it all, there's a new opinion that completely shocks me. So the work of a peace builder then is to create an environment to hold space for people to be in that field, where they can wrestle with opinions that are different from theirs, where they can wrestle with stories that might be shockingly similar to theirs, but the outcomes are different. So to me, that is who a peace builder is. It's someone who works very much with people, with their ideas, with their belief systems, to hold space for a broader collective reality to be in place.
Firstly, I love that Rumi quote and the concept of holding space for people in that field. And, another thing you said that stood out to me was the idea of people can have common stories, but the outcome can be different. And it just makes me think of just these underlying values or needs we have as people that can get lost when you add all the other layers. And so I am curious, how did you come to that? Like, how did you come to knowing, very beautifully said and articulated, how did you come to know that that could be something that you could offer, and that you were capable of doing?
I think in a lot of ways, I still wonder if I am capable. And I know deep down, yes, I have the capabilities and the skills and the heart and mind for it. There's a few different ways that I came to it. So it's a combination of lived and learned experience. I grew up in a very high conflict environment, culturally, socially, geographically, and often saw the impact that conflict had on people. And in every place in society, whether that was, nation to nation conflict or tribes in conflict or families in conflict or even within families. So I think from a very young age, I was just this very curious person who was always asking the why and trying to understand why someone would make those decisions or say things like that. So I was always that kid who was very curious. So that coupled with my grandfather and my great grandfather were I come from the Gajarah clan, which is people of the milk, and so they would go door to door in our small community in Lahore, Pakistan, distributing milk. So they were essentially the milkmen, if in the community. So every morning they would go door to door and they had this deep respect of the community. So whenever there was conflict in the community, people would come to our family home and say to my grandfather, great grandfather, can you help us resolve this? And it was everything from land to murder to domestic issues to whatever you can imagine under the sun. And sometimes people would come from far away just to spend time with the family to understand. And so I had this incredible privilege of just observing my elders deep in that environment of listening and holding space and food and ritual and all of that incorporated in how they approached conflict. So I think I realized later on in my life that I was already doing those things as a part of who I am. And then of course as you build your career, you go look for the right certificates and credentials to allow for that to be a reality. So a combination of lived and learned experience.
I love that you know that family history of yours and how much, because it's always interesting parts of ourselves that you don't know how it's been shaped. And then you're like, that's so
Mm-hmm.
beautiful to know that about your family. Another theme that I picked up very much around peace building is storytelling. So that comes up quite a lot. I know you have
Mm-hmm.
an organization. Hopefully, I'm saying it correctly. Kahanee. Is that the correct? Kahanee?
Kahanee, yep, Kahanee.
And it's peace building through storytelling. So now tell me about that. How did you
Mhm.
combine those two worlds, and sort of what does that organization do? What's the impact been?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So the word Kahani means story in three South Asian languages. And I'm learning more and more that apparently the word is anchored and the word means story in several other South Asian languages, which is really neat. When I think about storytelling, to me, it's a combination of I grew up in a very orally rich tradition of storytelling and story work. Our parents would often tell us what not to do by telling us a story. And so, it was never like, don't do this. It was like, have I told you the story of this kid who did this and this gruesome thing happened to them? And you're like, whoa, I never want to do that. So it was just this very interesting approach to behavioral management, if you will, of kids and, instilling teachings. So very rich culture of allegories and metaphors and storytelling. So that I think that was in a lot of ways already a part of my DNA. And then when I started working more deeply in the world of conflict transformation, I realized that it is it's hard for people to articulate what happens within a very rigid framework. It's often easier for people to tell the story. And storytelling is one of those things that's so accessible. You don't need a fancy degree, you don't need to hold a certain job. You can be anybody in society, any level of competence or understanding, a way of knowing or being, and you can still tell a story. And so storytelling can then become this very accessible way for people to come together. And especially in conflict, that's what we're paying attention to. What is the story that the person is telling? And what lies beneath that story? What are some of the similarities in that story to other people? So it can be just a really powerful tool to help approach conflict transformation and healing, for that matter, through storytelling.
I feel the same way about storytelling. I love films and movies, and I always say, like, there's two ways to travel physically, and the other is you go watch a film or a movie or read a book, and you're transported to another world, and you can relate so much to other people. And it's exactly what you're saying, which kind of goes back to the field, right? Which is, on the surface, it might look like people want different things, but I always think when in a story, you realize everyone really wants the same things and they're sort of manifesting or coming out in very different ways. So I love that. And so, speaking of storytelling, this is a great segue into talking about your book, which your first book came out in September. Congratulations. I can't imagine how that must feel.
Thank you.
I bought your book immediately. It is funny because I was going to bring it with me on vacation, and then I paused because I started reading it and I was like, will this be too heavy for vacation? So I waited until after. But I will say, it does cover quite intense themes and important themes, but I think it is done in a way that surprised me, that I thought I would have to put it down more and not be able to. So I did want to share that I thought it was done in a way that, as much as you're taking in things, I could still read it and keep going. And so I want to hear more about, when did you know you're going to write this book? What made you go, I need to put this down on paper? And how was the experience of writing this book?
I really appreciate that feedback. My goodness, I was so worried when I was writing this book that is it done in a way that holds that grief with care? And a huge part of my work is in the space of trauma-informed storytelling, trauma awareness, and trauma-informed engagement, and how we come together. And so that was really important. Like, even though the story itself may be deeply, deeply challenging, does it still have space for healing and understanding to happen? Like, you don't want to completely destroy someone with your story. There has to be space for healing in that. So I really appreciate that, and I'm glad that that's how it landed for you. I decided that I was ready to write when there was this time that everything seemed to shift to an incredibly polarized place in society. And I found that people were hating on each other more, and they were taking harder positions and didn't even know why they were taking positions. And sometimes people were doing that out of allyship, but it was all clunky and wasn't making sense. And the more I paid attention to what was happening in the world around me, the more it was black and white. What is right? What is wrong? And I felt like there was a need for there to be language in between. And by in between, I don't mean the middle ground. I literally mean that field where there's so many other ways that you can manifest something or describe something. So that was one thing that prompted this idea that, okay, it's time to write. So that was one. The second one was, I had also been thinking for a long time about the difference between Western-centric notions of feminism, and specifically white feminism, and feminism for the rest of us who have a little bit of a different lived experience, if you will. And increasingly was getting really frustrated with how much difference there was in our experiences when we approach feminism. And one of the areas that I specifically wanted to highlight was resistance, resilience, and hence feminism doesn't have to be loud and bold and out there. Because when we assume that that is the only way that we resist, we take away the experiences of so many women around the world. So many women express resilience and strength through many, many quiet ways. And I really wanted to find space to honor that. So I think those two big things came together for me one day. And I thought, okay, it's time. Let's go. And then the book happened.
So many things I was writing notes of. I agree so much, because actually one other feeling I had reading this book, because working in this space, I'm often asked, like, how did you get into the space? And I can't remember a time I didn't think about my gender. And for context, my parents are Tamil Sri Lankan, have came here in the 80s because of the war, and so very much I grew up with kind of a refugee cultural context of growing up in Toronto. And I think it's taken me a long time to understand the intersectionality of all of that. And even if you've grown up here, how it shows up in spaces. So actually, in reading the book, it took me back to some of that, of like trying to, without words, being like, yeah, this is what I mean. There was never a moment. It's just, I've always had to think about it. I've always been aware about it. And so there was so much of it that I saw or could relate to. And I feel there's not many stories that you get to, like you said, when you're, growing up here, you don't get that full intersectional lens, which is what I appreciated about that. And I love what you said about the idea of resistance and resilience doesn't have to be loud. And so I think, there's a lot of things about gender equality that are being spoken of very much in this book. What would you say are conversations when we think about gender equality that more people need to be having right now?
Oh, yeah. Oh my gosh, so much. I think when I say that not everything has to be loud, I'm often, and in the circle of friends and colleagues and peers, there's always a lot of conversation on this topic about, well, what does that look like if it's not loud? Because the need might be loud. And absolutely, I think there are some matters that absolutely need to be loud and bold, and the louder, the better. And then there are others that can have a little bit more breathing room. And I'm always a huge advocate of this idea of, I call it like a bit of a zipper. So, when we try to make change, if we're only focused on one strategy or one tactic, chances are it's probably going to fall apart. But it's, if we want change, we need to think about all the levels in society that we can plant the seeds of that change. And only then can that change be sustainable. And that's sort of the philosophy I use for peace building as well. So then, taking a step back, when I think about gender equality, I think in those conversations, we have to have the nuance in our thinking to think about, who does this impact and in what ways? Are we only trying to push for issues that may land well for one segment of society, but not do much for the rest? And that's okay. It doesn't mean we don't push for that. It just means we need other modalities to push for the rest of society. So I think the advances that were made on gender equality are significant. And my goodness, I'm so grateful to everybody who advocates, because it takes so much of the personal energy and heart and soul for it. I think we just have to have more nuanced conversations about change. So as long as we're doing that, then I think the path looks good.
And that brings me to another point you've said, because basically a lot of what I'm hearing is moving away from black and white, being in the gray. But I love the term you use, the in between, because I feel like that captures something that I think a lot of people in identity and conversations feel the sense of being in an in between. And so, and you also bring up another great point about just this idea, going back to the concept of with gender equality and pushing for change and advocating for change. I do think everyone has a role to play, whether they're loud or not. And I think sometimes we don't recognize it's a privilege when people can be as loud as they, and other kind of quieter but strong, still as strong and resilient ways. And so that's always just something I keep in mind too, that everyone's playing a part. Even, it's kind of like the idea of like, sometimes we look at the loudest person in the room, but that's not the only thing that's happening in the room. And so I very much wanted to kind of just add on your point that I very much agree with that. Okay, so you've talked so much about all your wonderful work that you're doing, and You seem so calm and so, I feel that energy, but I'm sure doing this work is not easy. I think about the world we're in. You're talking about conflict. I feel like we're at such a moment in time where I think people are feeling all the things. So, one, I'm adding this question because you do come off so calm and kind of, I almost just feel like the world's great because I'm talking to you and I'm like, everything's fine. But I guess for you, yeah, what's the reality of when you're doing this work? How do you take care of yourself in doing this work? And then what keeps you motivated and hopeful on days that maybe it does feel like I'm not the right person, maybe nothing's going to change?
I've had a really remarkable journey over the last little while of focusing on healing. And for many years in my life, I was so angry at the world and all of the injustice and the unfairness, and being a newcomer to Canada myself, navigating all sorts of barriers. Like, I would feel enraged when people would talk about just be yourself, because being yourself is a privilege not everybody has. And I love that you had mentioned that as well. And I would feel this rage, and I would just go into this like dark place where I didn't know how to understand my feelings and all of that good stuff. Over the last few years, I've come to this important realization that if we want peace in the world, it needs to start from within. I need to find the peace within myself so that when I'm talking about peace, I can relate to the anger and the frustration and the grief. And also, I'm coming from a place of calm that allows people to be in that space in a safe way. So I've really had to focus on both like my healing along with the healing of everybody else. And in a lot of ways, in writing the book, I remember wrestling with like, there's a lot of important healing messages. And I would say this to myself, girl, you're putting a lot of healing messages in this book. Are you following those yourself? And it was sort of this accountability thing. So the ways that I take care of myself, I am on this incredible ritual every morning of meditating, and I take my time. That's how I start my day. And sometimes I fall asleep because clearly I hadn't slept enough. But it's an important way for me to start my day. And I then go for a workout. I move my body before anything else. And then I start my day. And what's that also done is just built a stronger somatic connection between what's happening in the world and how I'm feeling. And it's not perfect. I sometimes still go right back where, things were feeling really turbulent in me, but I'm being very intentional about it. So that allows me to enter spaces where I know we need to collectively heal just in a more intentional way. And it keeps me accountable to take care of myself, to be able to take care of people around me. So it's been a good practice.
And then it goes back very much to the saying, you're only as good to other people as you are good to yourself. And I'm also a parent of two young kids. And I often say, like, I pour into me because I can't show up for them if I'm depleted, if I'm not feeling. And also, I have to be the example, right? Because, like, it's that whole saying, like, you could say the things, but people are going to watch what you do and copy what you do. So I think that's a great way to apply to even the work that you're doing, right? What you're saying versus what you're doing. And I think that's very important in leadership and how you build trust when people kind of see the consistency between the
Oh,
two.
absolutely. And I think, the one nuance there that I would offer is when we think about self care, and people think about self care in so many different ways, the nuance for me is I decided a while ago that my care was going to be focused on caring for the little girl in me. And that just switched the frame for me, because caring for this me looks different from caring for the younger me, because the younger me wants to hear kindness, wants to hear love, wants to hear compassion. And especially women are so unkind to themselves. So I think that nuance is really important if we want to show up in good ways for others. Is you're not just caring for yourself in a superficial way. You're really deeply invested in the little child in you who needs to hear all the right things.
And it's also a good reminder that I think in many communities, women often feel selfish. I put that in quotation marks, but selfish if they do that because it's sort of this constant caregiving for other pattern. So I think you are reminding that essentially to be able to do that, you are part of the caregiving that needs to also happen. Yeah. Well, Samaya, you're a lovely human. I feel like I could talk to you forever. And unfortunately, we do have a time cap on the podcast. But I do want to know if there's anything else you want to share with our listeners and anything else that we may have not discussed that you feel is important to share, especially the time that we're in, or anything even kind of related to gender equality that's been on your mind.
I think the only other thing that I would offer is you often hear this phrase about, be the change that you want to see in the world, and that can be so overwhelming because I want so many things in this world to change. And I get overwhelmed. And even as someone who is deeply embedded in this work, I get so overwhelmed with how is that even going to be possible? So I tell myself that every little thing matters, and I'm going to keep doing what I do, and the change will come. So find those glimmers that can motivate you. And I think that can go a long way to keep everybody motivated to be a part of the change they want to see in the world.
Thank you for helping shift the story on safety, leadership, justice, power, and rights. You can visit canadianwomen.org today to learn more and stay connected. We believe everyone should be able to exist without fear of harassment or abuse. You can help make that a reality. Text SAFE, SAFE, to 20222 to give $10 and support women, girls, and gender diverse people throughout Canada. Small actions can lead to big changes. We appreciate your support.